social spheres, John Della Volpe, pollster at the Harvard Kennedy School, to announce the results of the benchmark poll just done very recently.
Yes, yeah, we're so excited. Thanks so much for having me, Kate. Yes, we conducted 403 interviews with Rhode Islanders over the course of 3 days post-Columbus Day, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. We spoke to 39% of the folks we spoke to were over the mobile telephone, the rest of the folks were over the landline telephone, and we're really excited to share the results.
Okay, well, fantastic. So we got a little bit of the breakdown here, and what we're going to do is, for viewers who are watching right now, go through some of the data, sort of that top-line level numbers that John's going to break down a little bit further here. We're just going to bring it straight to you, so bear with us. Okay, let's start with the first. Now, these are just a sampling of some of the questions that we decided that we wanted to talk about here today. In general, would you say things in Rhode Island, this was asked to the respondents, are headed in the right direction, or are they off on the wrong track? Right track, 39%. Wrong track, 45%. Mixed 10, don't know 6. Very low, don't know numbers. What do these numbers represent, John?
Well, a couple of things. Okay, we're talking, I want to be clear, we're talking to voters. We're talking to folks who vote in 80% of the last several elections, and they're likely to vote next year.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important that we delineate voters versus overall residents. And 39% right track, a couple of things to put it into context. One is Rhode Islanders feel the state is better than the country as a whole. Right track, wrong track on the United States is about 10 points lower than it is in Rhode Island.
Okay.
So context there. That's good news, right?
Mm-hmm.
The bad news is it's still, far more people think things are heading in the wrong direction than the right track. I've done some other polls over the last year or so. This is a little bit better than it was a year ago.
Okay.
But still a significant concern, I think, for the folks who are responsible for governing the state in the next couple of years.
And I know you've got some notes with you here, again, sort of those crosstabs of
Right.
breaking down the demographics, if you will. Do you have that for this particular one?
Yes, and we'll talk about in some of these questions there are very distinct differences based on party ID, based on age, based on where you live.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, not. So in this case, not surprisingly, significant differences based on party ID. Democrats believe that the state is heading in the right direction. Over 60% of those folks. A concern, I think, for elected officials is that among the unaffiliated independent voters, the percent who think things on the right track is less than 35%. It's in the low to mid 30s.
And you mentioned nationally. I mean, what is this? You know, as you said, broken down by party line. Is this difficult for incumbents?
It's difficult, I think, for all incumbents. We've seen that obviously kind of with the rise of populism from both the right as well as the left. But I spend a lot of time traveling across America, conducting town meetings and focus groups, conducting other surveys, and I think that speaks to those folks in New England as well. There's some real anxiety, and it cuts across every aspect of public as well as personal life. And I think these are, you'll see these in the numbers. It's difficult to find folks who are relaxed and settled when it comes to the role of government today. In addition to that, listening to the last segment, I hear that in focus groups and town meetings. There's also concern about personal security, health, opioid addiction. So it's a very difficult time, I think. And Americans, Rhode Islanders in particular, are looking to rebuild trusted institutions. They want to be united, not divided. They want to trust government. They believe government does have a role to play.
Mm-hmm.
They're just not sure that it's always aligned with what Rhode Islanders in this case are looking for.
Now, as we've told viewers before, as we were previewing this, I mean, we call this the benchmark poll. The polls moving forward will be based. This is the baseline. This shows us moving towards the election. How much things will vacillate. So we'll see next time.
We'll see. And I guess the last thing I want to mention to this, as we tee up a couple of other questions, Kate, is which I think is good news. At Harvard, I focus mostly on studying millennials or the youth vote, and there is a thread of positive news, I think, for the youngest Rhode Island voters. They are more likely than older voters. In this case, I'll put millennials and Gen X in the same category than older voters. So there's some optimism there. Young people think they're more likely than their parents or grandparents. I think the state's heading in the right direction.
Okay, breaking down the first question here. Let's go to the next one. Okay, the key issues. What would you say is the #1 problem facing Rhode Island that you would like the governor to address? So jobs and economy, education, taxes, roads, state budget, kind of taking those top levels, again, economic issues. Was this a surprise?
It's not a surprise. I've been polling in the state for a couple of decades, I think, at this point, and those are probably the same open-ended responses that we had back 10 years ago and 15 years ago. So in that regard, not much has changed. So that's not good. We still hear, this is an open-ended question, which means that we ask what the number one issue is, and folks could spend as little or as much time as they wanted to kind of, to get that off of their chest. So we heard specific things like more aid to small companies, where it's very, very specific things around pension reform, which I've been hearing here almost my entire adult life, right? And we heard very specific comments still about Kirk Chilling and kind of relationship with his company going back several years. So these issues are still very, very raw in the voters' minds, and they just haven't gotten over these things. In addition to that, I think there's a real need to kind of address still auto taxes, and of course more investment we're hearing in education and roads and bridges. So.
Roads and bridges constants, because one of the things we see here in Rhode Island, we are always ranked bottom for roads and bridges. Is this kind of along the lines for other states, or is this higher, again, due to sort of the condition that we find? Or if there's potholes anywhere, do people say, please fix them?
Yeah, no, I typically find infrastructure, roads and bridges higher in our Rhode Island work than we find in other places.
Well, interesting, the roadworks projects, obviously looking to toll trucks to address the issues. We'll see, again, future polls moving forward on that. You mentioned 38 studios. Was it something that, wasn't able to necessarily accommodate in the poll language? I mean, it's not something a governor can address, but it's something you've heard about.
Yeah, it's something that just speaks to the relationship that voters have with government and the track record of certain kinds of investments. It's still kind of on the minds, as in some ways kind of epitomizes whether so a lot of folks just feel like government isn't necessarily always in it for the everyday person, and that you have to be special, you have to know someone, you have to be a big company or something to get the breaks that regular people have, and we see that quite a bit wherever we are, but specifically in Rhode Island.
It's interesting, healthcare on this list. We just had some big news this week, Memorial Hospital closing. Again, the healthcare industry in Rhode Island is in such flux right now. That will be an interesting subject.
It is, and it's not, it's only, in the low single digits, only 3% said that was the most significant issue at this time. But again, we'll continue to track it over the next year.
We'll see moving forward. Yep. Again, benchmark poll. Let's go to the next question. Okay, over the past 3 years or so, would you say the economy in Rhode Island has improved, gotten worse, or not changed at all? Not changed is the biggest one at 43%. Change for the better, 35%. Change for the worse, and again, a very low number of not refused. So most people said not changed or change for the worse. Change for the better is the smaller subset of those two combined.
Yes, there's a couple different ways to look at this, but you certainly have a plurality. Most people say things over the last 3 years haven't significantly changed statewide, right, in terms of the overall state and health of the Rhode Island economy. 35% changed for the better. The ones who think things have changed for the better, not surprising, it's a political question for Democrats, right? So
yes.
Again, this is something that's split pretty directly on party lines. I think we'll get into this a little bit more and see some even more interesting results when we move from the overall state economy to the personal finances and the kind of the economies and the neighborhoods across the state.
Now, can you weigh in on the unaffiliated voters in this category? Talk about the Democrats being
yes.
a little more bullish.
I have so many numbers here. Yes, you have a plurality across of every single category, and you have unaffiliated voters again, kind of on the lower end in terms of things not moving as quickly as they would like. I think in the state economy.
Okay, let's go on to the next question. Okay, this is that personal financial situation that we talked about being sort of key here. Over the same time period, these 3 years, has your family's financial situation improved, gotten worse, or not changed at all? Change for the better, 26%. Change for the worse, 19%, not changed. So talk with us about this, because we discussed this before. Again, how the economy is functioning as it impacts your own personal and family finances.
Yes, and we've seen a significant change in how voters in this state and around the country kind of respond to questions like this, and certainly kind of pre and post kind of the Great Recession. I think this is one of the most important questions that any pollster can ask. We don't see a lot of questions like this in public polls. We're seeing, a quarter of Rhode Island voters say things have gotten better, but those 26% are, most of those folks are under 40 years old.
Okay.
Most of those folks have a college education, and they feel pretty good in terms of where things are. It's the rest of Rhode Island that's older, less educated, that are kind of more struggling in a more significant way. What's most interesting about this question is there's no party difference. Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, there is no statistical difference, which means it's not about politics or partisanship. It's about how do I feel, personally and as a member of my family right now. And 54% not changed. It's only a +7 in terms of people saying things have gotten appreciably better versus worse.
So here we are. It's October 2017. We're looking ahead at the 18 races. Clearly, we're going to be doing several polls. I mean, how much you've been in the field so many times, how much can change over a year?
Things can clearly change. I mean, very few people predicted Donald Trump being president a year ago. So things can clearly change. But to make things change, politics needs to be tangible, right? So when I asked a year before the election, I said, "How were your personal finances?" And once you kind of get into it a little bit, people talk, in very great detail about having to, in some cases, literally sell possessions in their home to keep a roof over their head, right? Or having to choose between one college and another college, or maybe not college, right, for a young family. So politics, the economy is very tangible. The candidates who can make that sort of connection over a relationship, over a shared experience, and rather just about policy, are the ones that will kind of create trust, rebuild trust, and then be more successful when it comes to campaign season. This is a time that this needs to happen for both the governor, state legislators, as well as members of Congress. Rebuild trust, begin to understand some of these shared experiences. Whether we like it or not, 75% of Rhode Island voters say things are not gotten better, in their homes from a financial point of view. That needs to be addressed, and we need to help folks, if it has changed, help folks understand how to measure things and how to talk about it in a tangible way.
And how does that line up with the rest of the country, John? Are we looking here at Rhode Island? Is this sort of parallel sort of what folks are feeling nationwide, or is it different here in Rhode Island?
I think it parallels the nation generally, despite the fact that that the stock market is doing well on a national basis. The job market seems, I'm not expert, seems to be doing well in Rhode Island. You still have this unsettled sense, this fear, and we released a poll just in July or so, and I think we had a majority of all Americans were fearful about the economy in the short to mid-term. Stock market looks good, but there's still some underlying sense of fear and anxiety that needs to be addressed. You can't talk over it. You need to make that connection, kind of rebuild. So again, looking looking nationally, Rhode Island looks good. Locally, it's difficult to compare to Massachusetts today. We have the most popular governor in the country by almost every single measure. We have one of the most popular mayors in Boston by almost every single measure. I was doing some research recently where folks in a qualitative way almost thought we had too much development, almost too many jobs, because there's so much kind of pressure even on small businesses. So it's a difficult environment. Trying to kind of cut through from a national basis, but also trying to kind of compete against Boston just up the road.
Absolutely. I raised that question about things changing quickly in a year. Of course, we know the example with Donald Trump changing so rapidly, but the economic issues, we have a governor here who's very invested in bringing big companies in, big tax breaks in, promising jobs, promising economic development. From an economic, can people feel in their pocketbook within this space of a year a big shift up or down?
Well, I think that's the lesson of this, right? Is that there are I would argue there's probably more jobs today than there were 3 years ago, but that the economic impact hasn't necessarily been felt yet, right? And there are obviously other factors at play as well. So it's difficult, but I think so many voters kind of vote kind of with their hearts. rather than just their head. So having that kind of connection with a voter and that shared kind of understanding of where someone's coming from is so important. And listen, you don't need me to talk about that. Vice Yancey's success, right, wasn't always based upon policies, and it wasn't always even based upon trust, right? It was a trust that he understood the way people live their lives, and he was kind of out for them, right? Other elected officials have done that in different ways, but those personal relationships in such a small state, so incredibly, I think, valuable.
Okay, so let's go down to our next slide here, John. Let's move on. We've got a few questions for our viewers here today that we're going to share with you. Do you approve or disapprove of the way Governor Raimondo is handling the state economy? Now, we talked about this in the green room prior. Approval at 41%, disapproval at 48%. Don't know or refused at 11%.
Yeah.
We did talk about just mirrors her, what she was elected on.
Yes, exactly. So that's her vote, I think, almost to the number, right? 41% voted for her 3 years ago. That's one. And when I look at this relative to the number of individuals who believe the economy has made a tangible improvement, it's actually lower than that, right? So she's actually getting more credit, actually, right, at 41%, which is in some ways a good thing, right? On the other hand, still nearly a majority kind of disapprove. Those folks probably didn't vote for her. So not a lot has changed kind of in that regard. Obviously highly partisan. Young people, again, more likely to be Democrats, believe she's done kind of a better job with the economy. There are other questions we've asked that I think we'll be releasing in the day or so ahead. But in this case, it's 41%. It's where she started. Needs to certainly kind of improve. It's the most significant predictor of right track, wrong track. It's the most significant predictor, I think, of who the next governor will be. Right? Who is going to do a better job managing the economy moving forward?
So as you say that, as the elected official, as she sees that number, again, that needle not moving despite the efforts that she has been promoting, again, as you said, the jobs numbers going up. So is that concerning, as you said, to an elected official to see that level being stagnant?
Yeah, so seems to be holding the Democrat base pretty well. 64% of self-identified Democrats approve of the job that she's doing handling the economy, and only 34% of unaffiliated, I'll call them independent voters, think the same way. There's a lot of work to do there. There's a lot of work to do there. And there's also a lot of work with really kind of the, I think kind of the foundation of the Rhode Island electorate. Obviously independent, but she does so well with millennials. 53% approve of the way in which she's handling the economy. That's good. But we know millennials, especially in non-presidential years, not voting, sadly, at the same rates that their parents and grandparents are. So there's a lot of work to do to talk about not just the Rhode Island economy moving forward, but moving forward for everyone, and explaining why new jobs is great because it can keep your sons and daughters in the state, which has been a problem before. So many folks I talked to were concerned about raising a family, raising their kids, and their kids having to move up to Boston or down to New York or to Connecticut or somewhere out of state. And family is so important to Rhode Islanders. That's good news. And perhaps stories like that can be part of a narrative to help talk about what the plan is for the Rhode Island economy, because something isn't really working right now between kind of the way in which the governor is approaching these and the way in which 40, 50, 60-year-old Rhode Islanders are kind of responding to that. Something is just not working. And
let's talk just a little bit, if we can back up from the questions, if you will. You talk about millennials and folks who probably, if they're, again, optimistic about the economy, intending to want to stay here, we've had them in studio before, is there concern for those 40, 50, 60s? We always talk about that Florida flight, those older folks leaving the state. We have serious population concerns. Is that of concern, seeing sort of the disaffection of an older population who might have the means and decide upon retirement to up and leave? Well,
and I think it's all kind of connected to, voters are smarter most of the time than we think, right? They've been asking for the same things for a long time. Rebuilding infrastructure, whether that's roads, bridges, education, all of those things are going to be connected to creating a better economy where folks can live here as long as, if they choose to, and as long as they want. Lowering taxes to folks can stay in their houses longer. So Rhode Island is such a special place in terms of having that family relationship, the family dynamic. We don't have that necessarily kind of, where I live just an hour north. To the extent that I think it's still a part of the culture here, which is terrific. And I think that's what Rhode Island wants, right? They want to maintain that kind of connectedness to their community. They're concerned, though, that that I think, and it's not new, that the state health and elected officials aren't necessarily always on the same page, don't understand how one investment or one policy can add to the overall quality of life. There's just a lack of, whether it's policymaking or communication, but there's just a lack of understanding and trust, I think, between the institutions and the everyday voters.
Well, again, we'll continue to look at these numbers moving forward because the benchmark poll just starting off.
Yep.
Let's go on to the next question, John. The POSOX.
The POSOX.
Okay, presented in exactly this language.
Yes.
So recently a proposal has been made to permit the issuance of $81 million in bonds by the state to build a new stadium for the POSOX. If there was an election today on this issue, would you vote to approve or reject issuing $81 million in financing supported moral obligation bonds to build the stadium?
So that's I've had the pleasure and the honor of conducting polls around for a long time. A lot of the times been focused on bond issues. So that's the language we use in every one of those instances. And in most of the cases, whether it's for measuring the poor or investments in education or green technology, et cetera, not surprisingly, there's tremendous support for these bond measures. Rhode Islanders are not afraid to invest in priorities, in what they consider to be priorities, things that lift up the entire state and add to the infrastructure. So Kate, there was not a lot of consensus on a lot of the poll questions we showed, right? I talked about Democrats thinking the economies want one way, Republicans the other way. This is a question, okay, where there is significant consensus. I have these numbers here. For example, 63% of Democrats reject that question if it were held today. 71% of Republicans, 69% of unaffiliated or independent voters. And particularly challenging for the governor is that over the course of the last several minutes, I've made the case that kind of her base vote are the younger kind of Rhode Islanders, right? That they are buying, they're optimistic about the future, they think their own situation is improved, they feel adamant. 80% of millennials are opposed to investing $81 million in bonds in the POSOX stadium.
So interesting you raise that point. We've covered a lot about the POSOX. We've had the POSOX in, we've had opponents to a new stadium, and one of the questions that we've constantly raised, and this is maybe outside the scope of the poll, it's almost the future of baseball. Who's going to the games, the attendance, if new stadiums are built, where attendance records went. It's interesting that you point out the differences between the younger demographic and the older ones. We've seen it anecdotally, but for that to be put sort of on paper, so to speak, to see the millennials sort of outright reject this proposal, it's interesting. And you do raise that point again, this hypothetical question that's been talked about, again, people wanting to see maybe it should be put before the voters. You've talked about bond issues before. And as you said, even recently, overwhelming support for bond issues. Were you surprised by these numbers?
Yes and no. The reason I'm not surprised, well, a couple things. I don't want to be harsh, but every group is adamantly opposed to this, right? The best group is the folks around Metro Providence. You have about 35% approved. That's the high watermark here. So relative to all the other bond measures, when I review what's happened in the last several elections, I'm somewhat surprised, but there are very few instances in the world where voters are approving building stadiums.
Yes.
Look at what happened in Boston with the Olympics. Look in Germany, look in Switzerland, look in Ukraine, look in Poland, look in San Diego where the Chargers, did a poll and they had 29% approval. We had 28, they had 29%. It failed with 65% rejection, and they obviously moving to Los Angeles. St. Louis recently, fans rejected a stadium for soccer. So it's just a really difficult environment, given the priorities across America today, to ask voters to invest in a proposal that many feel doesn't necessarily kind of help families and businesses in building infrastructure across the entire state. As much as I love the Paw Sox, as much as I love the Red Sox, it's just not what is a priority today in most voters' minds.
So they are going through the process right now at the Assembly, having hearings. Right now it's a legislative proposal. It's not something at this point to put, but the Speaker's indicated might be a possibility. The Governor's indicated could be a possibility. Should legislators be concerned if they move forward and opt to move forward with this plan from a purely legislative vote to having seen what the reaction is if the voters had that power in their hands to say, well, if we had the power, we would have rejected it?
I think they need to. I mean, this is a key. I mean, this is obviously kind of a key issue in the state right now. There are very few issues, Kate, that I can pull where we have a 3-to-1. There are very few issues, right? So where people aren't divided, people are really not divided; they're united. So yeah, legislators and others really have to listen if they move forward without a public process and a public vote or a radical change in the way this is being developed, positioned, etc. Because we've talked for the last several minutes about trying to find ways to build trust. Rhode Islanders don't want to be divided. They want to be united. They want to have a government that works for them. Doing this without more consultation or without more feedback and certainly a vote would be probably a death sentence, right, for many legislators. Elected officials.
And you said you heard when you polled folks that 38 studios came up. It might not be a question that ended up on the poll, if you will, but there's been a talk here about a 38 studios hangover of a reticence to not get answers from the criminal probe or just answers in general. If there was perhaps some impropriety of who knew what and when and had moved forward on the plan to personally benefit, does that impact?
I think the way I think about this, it's not about the Paw Sox. It's about the voters, right? And the voters love the Paw Sox. The voters go to the games, they watch it on TV, it's an important part of the community. That's fine, that's great, right? It's not about the Paw Sox. It's about what our economic priorities are today. When things are going the right direction, we want to continue to invest in things that will move the state forward faster. And there's certainly this hangover of 38 and Kirk chilling and all the things. We pick it up not just on this question, but we pick it up on the open-ended questions as well. That doesn't help, but it's not about the Paw Sox. It's about the voters wanting to invest in things they think are more important: roads, bridges, small businesses, certainly kind of education, lower taxes.
Well, it's a very interesting way to put it. Not about the Paw Sox, about the voters. So let's move on to the next question here, John. Might be the final one that we discussed.
Next question, you have to wait till tomorrow.
The next question, you have to wait till tomorrow. Well, we appreciate John Della Volpe coming in today. And just before you take off here, because we had a very interesting conversation, you focus a lot on millennials. You're up at the K school. A lot of times people lump them into the one group of the millennials. But we had a discussion. It's a wide range of how young people view politics in the world.
Yes, and millennials, the largest generation in the history of America and the world. There will be more people within this generation able to vote in the next presidential cycle than us, than Gen X, the Boomers, etc. So incredibly important voting bloc. The first half of this generation, folks in the late 20s and 30s, very very supportive of Barack Obama, obviously. The second part of this generation came of age, not really post Bush and Obama, came of age during this recession, and they were more independent-minded, right? And what happened was Republican had Mitt Romney in particular had a terrific opportunity to kind of engage on issues around the economy, on issues around school choice. Didn't, and what happened was Bernie Sanders essentially kind of drove a huge truck through that opportunity, and is in the process of making this second half of the generation among the most progressive we've ever seen, specifically when it relates to the role of capitalism and their views of that, and several other kind of issues where they've been tacking to the left over the last couple of years. But even more interesting than that for me lately is this post-millennial. Those folks who are in the next voters here, they might be 18, 19, 17 years old, and I don't necessarily see them as having the same, confidence or priorities as millennials. They've got severe, I think, anxiety when it comes to all things politics. They're literally kind of afraid to check their Facebook page or their phone, not sure what's going to happen, from Washington or kind of within their family or even within their friends. So I think it's really important that we rebuild trust, that young people want to be kind of connected. They want government to work. And I spent a lot of time at the Kennedy School trying to break down those walls, right? And try to bring, elected officials and other folks in to get to know young people so we can kind of rebuild trust in these institutions.
Now, I'm at the tail end of Gen X and millennials. You talk about the older ones and the younger ones. What's the cutoff for the end of the millennial?
Typically, millennial generation defined as people born between 1980 and 2000, right? So 17 to a 37-year-old.
Okay.
We're part of the same generation, barely, probably one on one end, one on the other end. But we have the Gen X, which is pretty small, and baby boomers. There's a fewer baby boomers than millennials. Millennials are essentially the sons and daughters of baby boomers, plus the role of immigration makes them the largest. And then you have those folks in their 60s and 70s and 80s on up are considered the silent generation.
Silent generation. Well, clearly we have heard from Rhode Islanders for the first part of the poll results that we heard here today with John. Tomorrow, Josh Fenton will be joining me in the office, in the studio here, to talk about some of the other questions, a lot of the responses to the performance of elected officials.
I can't wait.
And so, benchmark poll today, question for you. We're going to be doing several more of these moving forward. Same questions moving forward? Any new questions tossed in there? What are the next polls going to hold?
Yeah, well, certainly, being a benchmark, we'll certainly want to kind of track progress on several of the issues we talked about today, as well as what Josh will talk about tomorrow, but we'll clearly be adding questions. We're spending a lot of time invested in this project in Rhode Island, and the best way for me to ask questions isn't for me to ask them, is to talk to Rhode Islanders and find out what's on their minds, what they care about, and we'll try to kind of shape those into questions that provide some context, not just who's going to win, who's going to lose, but the kind of the underlying context of how people think about their lives, how people think about the state, and kind of what their needs are.
Well, I appreciate your taking the time to come down today to walk through this. I'm sure we'll have you back in studio for future polls. John Della Volpe with Social Sphere, partnering with Go Local for a series of polls. Released the benchmark data today. More to come tomorrow. But we've got our regular Thursday guest here in the studio, so we're going to take a quick break here. I'll be back in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Don't go anywhere.